More than 80 million people lived under the Nazi regime for 12 years without rebelling massively. It was not due to ignorance, it was due to fear. Since 1933, the German state constructed a system in which a word, a denunciation, or a suspicion was enough to lose one's freedom, job, or life. Arrests without trial, constant surveillance, and selective punishments turned silence into a social norm. It was not necessary to support the regime. It was enough not to stand out, not to ask, and not to speak. Repression did not need to be permanent or visible to all. It worked because it was unpredictable, legalized, and reinforced by the society itself. Neighbors reported on neighbors. Families engaged in self-censorship. Fear became a daily reality. How was a system built capable of paralyzing an entire nation? Why did millions choose to remain silent even when the violence was evident? And what happens when fear stops protecting and starts to fail? The birth of terror, when fear became state policy. On the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in a legitimate constitutional act. There was no coup d'état, there were no tanks in the streets, nor revolutionary proclamations in the early morning. Power came through political negotiations, pacts among elites, and the signing of official documents. This appearance of legal normality was fundamental to understand how fear could subsequently take hold without generating immediate massive resistance. The regime was not born by destroying order, it was born by appropriating it. During the first weeks, many Germans observed cautiously but without extreme alarm. Hitler had come to power through recognizable procedures. Political parties continued to exist. Newspapers continued to be published and institutions operated. Daily life did not change immediately. This superficial continuity masked a much deeper process, the transformation of fear from a fleeting emotion into a permanent tool of government. The regime understood from the beginning that absolute control could not be achieved solely through disorganized violence. Chaotic repression generates resistance. Systematic repression generates paralysis. For this reason, the first step was not to attack all of society, but to accurately identify whom to attack first. Communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and declared opponents were singled out as concrete threats. This initial targeting served a strategic purpose, to reassure the rest of the population. The message was implicit but clear. The danger has a name and a surname. And if you are not part of that group, you have nothing to fear. This segmentation allowed wide sectors of German society to tolerate the initial detentions. It was not about enthusiastic adherence, but rather a comprehensible defensive logic. As long as the punishment seemed directed against others, the threat remained distant. Fear then functioned as an instrument of separation. It created invisible borders between those who were at immediate risk and those who could still be considered safe. On the 27th of February in 1933, the Reichstag building was set on fire. The circumstances of the fire remain historically disputed, but its political consequence was immediate and undeniable. The government presented the event as evidence of an imminent communist conspiracy and used the emergency to obtain exceptional powers. The following day, the Reichstag fire decree was passed, which suspended fundamental freedoms: expression, assembly, privacy of correspondence and communications, and inviolability of the home. What was decisive was not only the content of the decree, but its form. It was not presented as a break with legality, but as its application in extraordinary circumstances. The rule of law was not openly abolished, it was reinterpreted. This distinction is fundamental. When repression is perceived as illegal, it can generate moral resistance. When it is perceived as legal, it generates confusion and passivity. Fear was thus shielded by the appearance of legitimacy. The following weeks confirmed that the decree was not a temporary measure. Thousands of people were arrested without formal charges, without trials, without defined deadlines. They disappeared from their homes during the night and reappeared weeks or months later in makeshift detention centers. Others simply did not reappear. The uncertainty about the fate of the detainees amplified the terror. Not knowing what was happening was, in many cases, more terrifying than knowing it. The application of the decree revealed another essential characteristic of the system in formation: selective arbitrariness. There were no clear public criteria about who would be arrested. This prevented people from rationally calculating their level of risk. Two individuals with seemingly similar behaviors could have radically different fates. This unpredictability paralyzed more than a completely indiscriminate repression, because it kept alive the hope of escaping punishment through obedience without offering real guarantees of protection. In March of 1933, the Reichstag approved the Enabling Act, which allowed the government to legislate without parliamentary approval. Formally, the parliament continued to exist, but it had ceded its essential function. This transfer of power completed the legal structure of fear. From that moment on, the regime could redefine the rules without institutional obstacles. The law ceased to be a limit on power to become its direct expression. The voting itself on the Enabling Act illustrated the atmosphere of intimidation that already prevailed. The parliamentary building was surrounded by members of the SA and the SS. Inside the chamber, the uniformed presence was visible and threatening. Several opposition deputies had already been arrested or prevented from attending. The voting was not free in any meaningful sense, but it maintained the formal appearance of democratic legality. This combination of veiled violence and legal procedure would be characteristic of the regime. The progressive dissolution of political parties and independent unions eliminated the spaces where the opposition could articulate collectively. It was not only about prohibiting organizations, but also about destroying networks of solidarity. Isolated fear is much more effective than shared fear. When individuals lose collective support structures, they are individually exposed to the power of the state. The Social Democratic Party, which had voted against the Enabling Act, was banned in June 1933. The Communist Party had been practically destroyed after the burning of the Reichstag. The centre and right parties dissolved themselves under pressure. By July, the Nazi Party was the only legal political organization in Germany. This political monopoly not only eliminated electoral alternatives, it eliminated the very possibility of imagining a different political future. At the same time, the construction of a repressive apparatus specifically designed to generate uncertainty began. The Gestapo, the state police, did not operate as a conventional police force. Its effectiveness did not depend on its actual size, which during the first years was relatively limited, but on the perception of its omnipresence. The average citizen did not know how many agents there were, where they were, or what criteria they applied. This opacity was deliberate. Fear works better when its reach is uncertain. The Gestapo operated outside traditional judicial controls. It could arrest, interrogate, and detain indefinitely without being accountable to ordinary courts. This legal autonomy made it a pure instrument of political will. It did not apply laws in the conventional sense, it applied the logic of the regime, and that logic was, by design, unpredictable for the average citizen. The first concentration camps were established in 1933, initially presented as preventive detention centers for dangerous elements. Dachau, inaugurated in March of that year, was the initial model. These camps were not completely hidden. Their existence was known in a diffuse manner. Rumors, indirect references, fragmented stories circulated among the population. The regime did not need to reveal all the details. It was enough for people to know that there were places where one could be sent without procedural guarantees. The concept of preventive detention was particularly insidious. It was not a punishment for crimes committed, but rather a supposedly protective measure against potential crimes. This logic reversed the presumption of innocence. Any person could be considered a future threat and therefore susceptible to detention. Fear was no longer based solely on what one did, but on what it was interpreted that one might do. The strategic use of selective violence reinforced this system. It was not necessary to repress massively. It was enough to visibly and disproportionately punish specific individuals. Every public arrest, every nighttime raid, every disappearance served a pedagogical function. The message was not only for the direct victim, but for all those who observed or learned about it. The terror spread through informational contagion. During 1934, the regime consolidated its control through the elimination of internal threats. The Night of the Long Knives, in June, was a purge within the Nazi movement itself, directed against the leadership of the SA and others considered potential rivals. What was significant about this episode was not only the internal violence, but its psychological impact on the general population. If the regime was capable of executing its own members without judicial process, no one could consider themselves truly protected by loyalty or position. The SA, the party's stormtroopers, had been fundamental in the rise to power. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, was one of the oldest Nazis and close to Hitler. However, when perceived as a potential threat, he was executed along with dozens of others. This fact demonstrated that proximity to power did not guarantee security. Past loyalty offered no protection against present suspicion. Fear thus penetrated even the elites of the regime. The death of President Hindenburg in August 1934 allowed Hitler to merge the positions of Chancellor and Head of State. This step eliminated the last symbolic counterbalance. From that moment on, the entire state structure converged into a single figure. Obedience to the state and obedience to the leader became indistinguishable. Fear no longer had multiple recipients. It had a unified and absolute source. The personal oath of loyalty that the armed forces took to Hitler after the death of Hindenburg was another decisive step. The military no longer swore to defend the constitution or the nation in the abstract, but to a specific individual. This personalization of power reinforced the structure of fear. Disobeying an abstract law is psychologically different from disobeying a person who has been turned into an absolute symbol of authority. By the end of 1934, the political and social landscape of Germany had changed radically. The institutions continued to function in appearance, but they had been emptied of real content. Work, school, and family life continued, but under profoundly altered conditions. Fear had ceased to be an occasional response to specific events and had become a structural component of everyday existence. This process was neither chaotic nor improvised. It was a deliberate sequence of steps designed to transform social behavior without causing an immediate violent rupture. The regime built fear as one builds infrastructure, with planning, with defined stages, with clear objectives. First, it identified enemies, then suspended guarantees, then eliminated institutional checks and balances, and finally normalized repression. Thus, the birth of terror as a state policy was completed. It did not arise from a single outburst, but from a calculated accumulation of measures that redefined the relationships between power, law, and society. Fear was no longer an accidental consequence of government. It was its fundamental method of control, and once installed in the structure of the state, it no longer needed to constantly justify itself. It simply existed, like the air we breathe, invisible surveillance, when everyone could be the enemy. Once fear was consolidated as state policy, the Nazi regime faced a considerable technical challenge: how to maintain control over millions of people without having unlimited resources for direct surveillance. The solution was as effective as it was unsettling: to transfer part of the control function to society itself. Fear would cease to depend exclusively on the physical presence of state agents to become a self-sustaining social phenomenon. The Gestapo never had the operational capacity to actively monitor the entire German population. In 1937, the total number of secret police officers across Germany was around 7,000 people. For a nation of more than 60 million inhabitants, this proportion was ridiculously low if direct and constant control was expected. However, the regime understood that effective surveillance did not require real omnipresence, but rather the widespread perception that no one could be sure of not being watched. This perception was constructed through the systematic promotion of civil denunciation. From the earliest years of the Third Reich, the regime actively encouraged the idea that reporting suspicious behaviors was a patriotic duty. The propaganda presented the informant not as a traitor to their neighbors, but as a guardian of the national community. This moral inversion was crucial. Reporting stopped being shameful and became virtuous. Reports reached the authorities through multiple channels: anonymous letters, verbal reports at police stations, communications through party organizations. There was no single or standardized procedure, which facilitated the very act of denouncing. Anyone, at any time, could point to another without the need for solid evidence or facing immediate consequences for false accusations. What is significant is that many of these accusations did not arise from deep political convictions. The files of the Gestapo reveal that a considerable proportion of the accusations responded to personal conflicts, property disputes, work rivalries, romantic jealousy, or simply malice. The system offered a legitimized channel to turn private resentments into political weapons. Someone annoyed with their neighbor could accuse them of making critical comments about the regime. Someone interested in a job could denounce the person occupying it for a lack of Nazi enthusiasm. This instrumentalization of everyday conflicts had a devastating effect on social trust. Interpersonal relationships were permeated by a permanent suspicion. It was not just about fearing the Gestapo, but about fearing anyone who could use the system for their own benefit. The enemy was no longer solely the repressive state, but potentially anyone from the close environment. Workplaces became particularly intense surveillance spaces. Factories, offices, and public administrations were environments where people spent long hours and where work-related tensions were common. An imprudent comment during a break, a misunderstood joke, an absence at a party official event could be reported. Professional competition blended with perceived political loyalty. Those aspiring for promotions could improve their position by demonstrating active surveillance over their colleagues. This dynamic generated a profound psychological phenomenon: preventive self-censorship. People began to filter their words not only based on what they thought, but also based on how they could be interpreted by others. Every conversation became an exercise in risk calculation. It was not enough to say nothing dangerous. It was necessary to avoid anything that could be misinterpreted as dangerous. The home, traditionally the most intimate and protected space, was also compromised. Nazi youth organizations, such as the Hitler Youth, instilled in children and adolescents the idea that loyalty to the regime was above any family bond. There were cases of children who reported their parents for critical comments made at the family table. Although these cases were not predominant, their mere existence was enough to sow doubt. Parents began to measure their words even in front of their own children. This fracture of the family unit had deep psychological consequences. The home ceased to be an absolute emotional refuge. Privacy eroded from within. Fear penetrated the most basic relationships of human life. Schools operated as centers of indoctrination, where not only Nazi ideology was taught, but also active surveillance. Teachers reported on students, students reported on families, families lived with the awareness that any comment made at home could end up being transmitted. The educational system ceased to be just a space for intellectual training and became a network of political information. Another fundamental element was the deliberate ambiguity about what constituted a punishable conduct. There was no exhaustive and public list of prohibited behaviors. The concepts were intentionally vague: defeatism, antisocial attitude, lack of enthusiasm, malicious comments. This imprecision forced people to constantly interpret what was dangerous and what was not, and, when in doubt, most opted for excessive restrictions rather than take a risk. The lack of clarity served a strategic function. If the rules had been precise, people would have known exactly how far they could go. The ambiguity expanded the territory of fear. Any action could potentially be interpreted as hostile. This uncertainty generated much broader self-censorship than an explicit ban would have produced. Surveillance also extended to recreational and cultural spaces. Sports clubs, cultural associations, religious groups, all were subjected to observation. Independent organizations were dissolved or integrated into structures controlled by the party. This eliminated places where people could gather without direct ideological supervision. Social life was reorganized so that there were practically no spaces truly free from state presence. The churches represented a particular case. Although the regime avoided massive confrontations with established religious institutions, it did exert constant pressure on priests and faithful considered unreliable. The sermons were monitored, religious youth activities competed with Nazi organizations, and critical clerics faced everything from administrative harassment to direct arrests. Private correspondence was also subject to potential surveillance. Although not all letters were read, the mere fact that they could be modified the way people wrote. Communications became cautious, loaded with euphemisms, devoid of any content that could be interpreted as critical. Even private writing practiced self-censorship. Over time, this ubiquitous surveillance produced a particularly unsettling phenomenon, the internalization of the observer. Even when a person was completely alone, the fear persisted. Ideas filtered through before becoming words, even when there was no one present to hear them. Critical thinking was repressed almost automatically. External control had transformed into unconscious self-control. This internalization of fear had lasting consequences. It not only modified public behavior, but also altered internal mental processes. People stopped fully articulating their doubts, even in the privacy of their own minds. The regime had managed to infiltrate not only the streets, but also individual consciousness. The effectiveness of this system depended on its probabilistic nature. It was not necessary for everyone to be reported, only that everyone knew they could be. It was not necessary for all reports to be investigated, only that some were. The possibility of punishment was enough to shape behavior. Fear operated not by certainty, but by calculated uncertainty. As the system matured, many Germans stopped perceiving this surveillance as an anomaly. It became part of the normal social landscape. People adjusted their expectations and redefined their notions of privacy. What, in 1932, would have seemed an intolerable intrusion, by 1937 was accepted as part of ordinary life. This normalization was perhaps the deepest achievement of the invisible surveillance system. It did not generate constant resistance because it ceased to be perceived as something to resist against. It had integrated so completely into daily experience that many people stopped consciously questioning it. The resulting social fragmentation weakened any possibility of organized opposition. Collective resistance requires trust, communication, and solidarity. By destroying horizontal trust among citizens, the regime eliminated the basic conditions for collective action. Each person was isolated in their own fear, unable to know for certain who shared their doubts and who might report them. For many, life under this system was not experienced as permanent terror, but as a succession of small precautions. Not talking about politics in public, avoiding certain companies, showing conformity when necessary. These adaptations were gradual and seemingly minor. However, accumulated, they built a profoundly transformed society. Thus, invisible surveillance fulfilled its primary purpose. It did not need agents on every corner, nor microphones in every home. It was enough to erode trust, sow doubt, and turn citizens into potential watchers of one another. Fear ceased to be something that the state imposed only from above. It became something that society reproduced horizontally, in every interaction, in every measured word, in every calculated silence. When a society learns to monitor itself, power no longer needs to exert itself so much. Control becomes self-sustaining, and fear, once distributed among millions of people, becomes almost impossible to eradicate. Exemplary punishments, when the suffering of some educated millions. Invisible surveillance generated diffuse fear, but the Nazi regime understood that sustained uncertainty needed to be periodically reinforced with concrete examples of what could happen when forbidden lines were crossed. Exemplary punishment not only served the purpose of eliminating individual opponents, its main purpose was pedagogical. Every public arrest, every political trial, every mysterious disappearance functioned as a collective lesson directed at millions of people who would never be directly punished, but who would learn by observing the fate of others. Visible terror operated through a multiplying logic. One single spectacular arrest could modify the behavior of thousands. A rigged trial broadcast by the press influenced entire communities. A well-known execution through rumors silenced complete regions. The regime did not need to punish massively, it needed to punish strategically, ensuring that each repressive act fulfilled the greatest possible deterrent function. The arrests began to acquire a calculated theatricality from the early years of the regime. The detentions did not always occur in secret during the night, although that was also a tactic employed. In many cases, the arrests were deliberately public. Agents of the Gestapo or members of the SS would arrive at homes, workplaces, or public spaces at times when visibility was guaranteed. The detained person was taken in view of neighbors, colleagues, or passers-by. This visibility served multiple functions. First, it confirmed that the repressive apparatus was real and active. The abstract threat manifested in concrete bodies being taken by force. Second, it generated an immediate emotional impact on those witnessing the scene. Seeing someone familiar being arrested produced a psychological effect much deeper than simply hearing that arrests were happening somewhere distant. Third, it initiated a process of informational propagation. Those who witnessed the arrest discussed it with others, and the story spread geometrically. Extended interrogations were also part of this strategy. The families of the detainees were left in absolute uncertainty. They did not know where their relative was, what exactly they were accused of, how long the detention would last, or what was happening to them. This lack of information was deliberate. The uncertainty amplified the terror. Families lived for weeks or months in anguish that was visible to their social environment. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances observed this indirect suffering and drew their own conclusions about the risks of dissent. The concentration camps played a central role in this exemplary terror system. Although most Germans never saw them directly, their existence was widely known. They were not an absolute secret, but a semi-public threat. It was known that there were places where people were sent without conventional trial, where conditions were brutal, and where the duration of confinement was arbitrary. Some political prisoners were eventually released, especially in the early years. These returns were not acts of free mercy, but part of the pedagogical function of the system. Those released returned to their communities marked physically and psychologically. Their deteriorated physical appearance, their affected emotional state, and above all, their forced silence about what they experienced conveyed a message more powerful than any official propaganda. They did not need to speak explicitly. Their bodies told the story. In addition, many released individuals had been forced to sign documents committing themselves to not speak about their experiences under the threat of being detained again. This prohibition created a communicative paradox. Their presence confirmed that the camps existed and were horrible, but their silence prevented knowledge of specific details. This combination of visible evidence and informational opacity maximized terror. Imagination filled in what the information omitted, and imagination under fear tends to concoct scenarios worse than the confirmed reality. Political trials constituted another fundamental tool of exemplary punishment. The German judicial system, which before 1933 had enjoyed some independence, was progressively subordinated to political objectives. Special courts were created specifically designed to judge political crimes. The People's Court, established in 1934, became the most notorious of these instruments. These courts did not operate according to traditional legal principles. The verdicts were frequently decided before the trial. The defense was purely formal. The accused rarely had a real opportunity to present arguments. The judicial process had become a punitive spectacle aimed at legitimizing decisions already made and publicly demonstrating the absolute power of the state over the lives of individuals. The sentences were deliberately disproportionate. Minor offenses received severe punishments. Critical comments could result in years of imprisonment. Listening to foreign radio stations, an offense defined during the war, could lead to the death penalty. This disproportion was not a flaw in the system. It was its defining characteristic. The goal was not legal proportionality, but social intimidation. The selective advertising of these trials reinforced their impact. Newspapers regularly reported on exemplary sentences. The cases were presented in such a way that any reader could potentially identify with the accused. They were not professional criminals or sophisticated conspirators, but ordinary people who had made seemingly minor mistakes. The implicit message was clear. If it happened to someone like you, it could happen to you. Executions, although less frequent than other types of punishment, had a disproportionate impact. During the Third Reich, thousands of people were executed for political crimes. These executions were generally not public in the sense of mass spectacles, but they were also not completely secret. Information circulated in a controlled manner. Families were notified late. Communities learned through informal channels. The knowledge that the state was willing to kill its own citizens for political reasons had a deeply paralyzing effect. The guillotine became the preferred method of execution for civil sentences. Its use was not accidental. It was an instrument that symbolically connected with the French Revolution and its mass executions, but now applied not against an aristocracy, but against common citizens considered enemies of the state. The symbolism was clear. No one was above the revolutionary power of the regime. The punishment also acquired economic and social dimensions that broadened its scope. The loss of employment was a common sanction for people considered politically unreliable. In an economy where the state increasingly controlled job opportunities, being unemployed for political reasons meant severe economic marginalization. This threat was particularly effective because it affected not only the individual, but their entire family. The confiscation of property, the prohibition of practicing certain professions, the exclusion from professional associations, all of these were forms of punishment that destroyed lives without the need for physical incarceration. They were less visible than an arrest, but just as devastating. And their latent threat acted as a constant reminder that dissent had multiple and lasting costs. A particularly effective aspect of the system was its unpredictability. There was no clear and proportional relationship between conduct and punishment. Two people who had made similar comments could have radically different fates. One could be arrested immediately, the other might not suffer any apparent consequence. This apparent arbitrariness was not a flaw of the system, but one of its strengths. Unpredictability prevented people from calculating risks rationally. If the punishment had been predictable and proportional, individuals could have assessed how far they could go without crossing the line. Arbitrary decisions eliminated that possibility. No one could be sure of what exactly would provoke a repressive response. This uncertainty expanded the realm of fear well beyond explicit prohibitions. The regime also directed exemplary punishments against specific figures to send differentiated messages. When respected intellectuals were arrested or forced into exile, the message was that education and status did not offer protection. When religious leaders were persecuted, it was demonstrated that moral authority was not a shield either. When members of traditional aristocratic families were punished, it became clear that lineage did not matter. Each type of exemplary victim communicated that no social group was immune. The case of people executed after the failed assassination attempt against Hitler in 1944 perfectly illustrates this pedagogical function. The conspirators were subjected to summary trials and executed in deliberately humiliating ways. Some were hanged with piano wires to prolong their agony. Footage of the executions was shown to specific circles as a warning. The message was not only against the conspiracy, but against any imaginable form of organized resistance. As the war advanced, the punishments intensified. The application of the death penalty for crimes considered defeatism or subversion of the war effort expanded dramatically. Military and civilian courts handed down capital sentences with increasing frequency. This escalation did not improve the regime's control. It revealed its growing weakness. When fear needs to be constantly intensified to maintain its effectiveness, it indicates that it is losing its structural power. However, during most of the Third Reich, exemplary punishment worked with disturbing effectiveness. It did not require universal repression, but rather selective and visible repression. Each victim served a multiplying function. Their individual suffering became a collective lesson. Fear spread from specific cases to entire communities. People learned not through direct instruction, but through observation. They saw what happened to others and adjusted their own behavior accordingly. This social learning of fear was profoundly effective because it did not depend on abstract threats, but on concrete examples. Terror had faces, names, fragmented stories that circulated in whispered conversations. The exemplary punishment also served a psychological reinforcement function for those who had chosen conformity. Seeing others punished confirmed that one's own decision to remain silent had been correct. It generated a retrospective rationalization. I did well not to get involved. Look what happened to those who did. This indirect validation of obedience strengthened the system from below. Over time, the accumulated memory of past punishments became a deterrent as powerful as present punishments. People remembered stories from previous years of individuals who had disappeared, of families destroyed. This collective memory of terror served as a permanent warning. The regime did not need to punish constantly because the memory of previous punishments kept fear alive. Thus, the suffering of a few was transformed into education for millions. The exemplary punishment not only eliminated individuals considered dangerous, it shaped the behavior of entire masses that would never be directly touched. It was an extraordinarily economical system of control in terms of resources, but devastatingly effective in terms of psychological impact. When a society learns through the punishment of others, it develops a form of anticipatory obedience. It no longer needs to be constantly threatened because it has internalized the lessons drawn from the suffering of others. Fear becomes social wisdom, and silence becomes a survival strategy validated by examples that no one can forget. Everyday silence, how obedience became a form of survival. By the mid-1930s, the system of fear had reached a stage of disturbing maturity. It no longer depended on spectacular episodes of repression or the constant renewal of visible threats. Terror had become so deeply integrated into daily life that obedience ceased to be perceived as an external imposition and began to be experienced as a rational choice, almost natural. Millions of Germans did not necessarily support the regime with ideological fervor, but they did not oppose it either. They simply lived within the system, adapting to its demands through small daily compromises that, accumulated, built a national culture of silence. This phase of fear was qualitatively different from the previous ones. In the first years, the terror had been visible and violent. Then it had become invisible and omnipresent through mutual surveillance. Now it was transforming into something even more insidious, a form of normalized life. Fear no longer needed to manifest constantly because it had become the permanent backdrop of existence. People stopped asking whether the system was fair and simply began to wonder how to live within it without attracting attention. The everyday silence was not the product of a single conscious decision, but rather of thousands of small adaptations. A political conversation avoided at a social gathering, an opinion not expressed during a family meal, a question that arose in the mind but was discarded before being voiced. Each of these renunciations seemed insignificant on its own. However, repeated day after day, year after year, they built a profound transformation in the way people related to the world and to themselves. Most Germans did not live in a state of permanent paralyzing terror. Life continued with its routines: work, meals, family celebrations, Sunday walks. But these ordinary activities now occurred within an invisible framework of internalized restrictions. People had learned which topics to avoid, which gestures not to make, which facial expressions to control. This self-censorship had become so automatic that many ceased to be aware that they were practicing it. One of the most powerful factors that sustained this daily obedience was the protection of the family sphere. For many people, silence was not justified as personal cowardice, but as responsibility towards loved ones. The regime had made abundantly clear that the consequences of behavior considered dangerous could extend beyond the individual. Children who lost educational opportunities because their parents were marked, spouses who faced social marginalization, entire families that suffered economic stigmatization. This collective threat transformed moral calculation. Risking individually might seem noble. Risking one's own children seemed irresponsible. The regime had managed to turn familial love into a tool of control. People rationalized their silence not as submission, but as a necessary sacrifice to protect those they loved. This logic allowed them to coexist with the system without experiencing a constant sense of conscious guilt. Mothers and fathers who in other circumstances would have defended moral principles were now calculating every word, thinking about the repercussions on their children. This transformation was not dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, almost imperceptible. A mother who stopped commenting on the disappearance of a neighbor, a father who avoided criticizing unfair labor policies, grandparents who stopped telling stories about earlier times when things were different. Each silence was justified as protection, and that justification made it psychologically bearable. The labor sphere played a crucial role in this normalization of fear. By the end of the 1930s, the Nazi state controlled directly or indirectly most of the German economy. Private companies operated within strict regulatory frameworks. Strategic industries were under state supervision. Independent unions had been replaced by the German Labour Front, controlled by the party. In this context, job stability increasingly depended on demonstrating political conformity. This economic dependency was particularly effective because it operated through incentives as well as through threats. It was not just about avoiding punishment, but about accessing opportunities. Job promotions, housing allocations, access to certain scarce goods, all of this could be facilitated by showing apparent loyalty to the regime. Obedience thus became an investment in stability and social mobility. In factories and offices, a culture of calculated ambiguity developed. Workers learned to navigate between the demands of labor productivity and demonstrations of political loyalty. Knowing when to participate in party events, when to make appropriate comments, when to show enough enthusiasm without exceeding to the point of seeming suspiciously exaggerated. This constant navigation required attention and energy, but it became a necessary social skill. People learned to engage in what might be called performative conformity. Attend party events when necessary, greet appropriately, repeat minimal slogans in public contexts, show enough enthusiasm not to stand out for their absence, but without necessarily feeling internal conviction. This social performance became an everyday skill. Most Germans became competent actors of their own loyalty. Over time, this constant acting produced complex psychological effects. There is a phenomenon known in social psychology where people begin to align their internal attitudes with their external behaviors to reduce cognitive dissonance. When someone repeatedly behaves as if they support a system, even if initially they do so out of fear or convenience, they may eventually begin to rationalize that behavior by adjusting their own beliefs. Not all Germans experienced this process, but it was common enough to have a significant social impact. The boundary between forced conformity and genuine acceptance became blurred. Many people lost certainty about what they truly believed because they had spent so much time acting in a certain way that their internal beliefs had partially adapted to their external actions. This phenomenon was particularly notable in the younger generation, those who had grown up entirely under the Nazi regime. For them, the restrictions of the system were not a new imposition on a previously freer world, but simply the way the world worked. They did not have a clear memory of how things had been before, so they lacked the frame of reference that allowed older generations to recognize the abnormality of their situation. Everyday language also transformed profoundly. Conversations became careful, imprecise, laden with euphemisms and insinuations. People developed ways of communicating that allowed them to convey ideas without committing explicitly. A glance, a tone of voice, an eloquent silence could communicate skepticism without articulating it verbally. This indirect language allowed for a certain form of human connection while minimizing risks. Certain words and themes simply disappeared from public conversation, not because they were explicitly prohibited in all cases, but because they had become dangerous by association. Speaking of justice, freedom, or human dignity in certain contexts could be interpreted as veiled criticism. People learned to communicate through omissions as much as through assertions. Even the way of thinking was affected. Many people began to avoid thinking deeply about complex political or moral issues, not because they lacked intellectual capability, but because thinking critically generated anxiety without offering practical solutions. If one could not act on their own conclusions, what was the point of reaching them? This voluntary reduction of the field of interest functioned as a mechanism of psychological protection. Partial ignorance became an emotional refuge. Many Germans stopped asking about neighbors who had disappeared. They stopped informing themselves about disturbing events. They stopped questioning evidently false official narratives, not necessarily because they believed them, but because questioning them mentally caused a discomfort that did not lead to any possible resolution. It was psychologically easier not to know. This self-imposed ignorance had an adaptive function. It allowed people to continue functioning in their daily lives without the constant weight of moral dissonance. When one knows too much about injustices that cannot be prevented, guilt can become unbearable. Not knowing, or pretending not to know, provided a temporary psychological relief, although it came with a long-term moral cost. Public spaces became stages where everyone played predefined roles. In social gatherings, conversations were deliberately kept superficial. People talked about the weather, work in technical terms, sporting events, and non-political family matters. Politics was a dangerous territory that was avoided by tacit consensus. This protective superficiality impoverished social relationships, but offered security. Even in the intimacy of home, fear left marks. Couples who had shared everything were beginning to have areas of silence, not always out of mutual distrust, but out of a shared desire not to put the other at risk through dangerous confessions. This protective silence could be an act of love, but it also created emotional distances. The closest relationships acquired areas of opacity that had not existed before. Some marriages developed private codes, ways of communicating about sensitive topics without using explicit words. Others simply stopped discussing certain matters. This self-censorship within the home perhaps represented the deepest penetration of fear into private life. When even in the intimacy of the bedroom, people did not feel completely safe to express their thoughts, control had reached an almost total level. Propaganda played a complementary role in this system, not so much by actively convincing, but by saturating the public informational space. By occupying all visible channels with a dominant narrative, the regime reduced the available mental space for alternative voices. The constant repetition of official messages did not need to be taken literally to be effective. Its omnipresence created the illusion that they represented social consensus. This illusion of consensus reinforced individual silence. When someone doubted the regime but did not hear anyone else expressing similar doubts, they tended to conclude that their skepticism was minority or even unique. This perception of isolation discouraged action. Resisting alone seemed not only dangerous, but also futile. The previous social fragmentation, a product of mutual surveillance, made it impossible to know how many other people shared similar doubts. The radio had become a fundamental instrument of this propagandistic saturation. Carefully designed programs filled the hours, mixing entertainment with ideological messages. Listening to the radio was a daily activity that constantly introduced the voice of the regime into the domestic space. Even those who listened with skepticism were being repeatedly exposed to the conceptual frameworks of Nazism. With the beginning of the war in 1939, fear took on new dimensions. Political repression was joined by material insecurity, human losses, and physical and emotional exhaustion. In this even more difficult context, many people prioritized immediate survival over any abstract political considerations. Silence further integrated as a practical response to an increasingly dangerous and chaotic environment. The war also introduced new forms of rationalization. In times of national conflict, criticizing the government could be perceived as betrayal not only to the regime, but to the soldiers fighting at the front. Many Germans had relatives in the army. The idea that expressing doubts could somehow harm the war effort and endanger those loved ones acted as an additional inhibitor of dissent. The material deprivations of war also diverted attention. Worrying about obtaining food, avoiding bombardments, and keeping the family alive became the absolute priority. The mental space for political reflection was reduced when the basic needs for survival demanded constant attention. Political fear competed with more immediate and tangible fears, the fear of hunger, of bombs, of losing loved ones on the front lines. The rationing of food, the endless lines, the constant search for basic items consumed time and energy that under other circumstances could have been directed towards critical reflection. This was not an accidental coincidence. A regime that keeps its population worried about basic needs is less likely to face profound political questioning. As the war progressed and the news from the front became less optimistic, a form of silent cynicism developed. People continued to recite official slogans in public, but with an increasing awareness of their falseness. This dissociation between external behavior and internal belief deepened. However, this skeptical awareness rarely translated into action. The habit of silence was too deeply rooted. This daily obedience had a psychologically devastating cumulative effect. The longer one lived in silence, the more difficult it became to break it. Past inaction turned into psychological weight. Speaking out would have meant not only confronting the regime, but also confronting one's own past choices. Acknowledging that one had remained silent for years, that one had witnessed injustices without protesting, that one had prioritized personal safety over moral resistance. This weight of silent complicity mixed with the fear of future punishment. Breaking the silence after years of apparent conformity could be interpreted as particularly suspicious. Why would someone who had been obedient for so long decide to rebel now? This logic trapped people in their own story of submission. The past silence became an argument for future silence. Silence was also sustained by emotional exhaustion. Living under constant fear, even normalized fear, consumes psychological energy. Many people were simply tired. Tired of calculating every word, tired of watching every gesture, tired of the permanent tension. This exhaustion did not generate heroic resistance. It generated apathy. Obedience became the path of least emotional resistance. For the majority of Germans, life under the Third Reich was not an experience of clear heroism or villainy, but rather of gradual adaptation to circumstances that seemed impossible to change individually. Each small concession was justifiable in itself. But those thousands of small concessions, multiplied by millions of people over the years, constructed a system of control that operated not primarily through open violence, but through the collective internalization of fear. Thus, everyday silence became the deepest and most enduring form of Nazi terror. It did not shout, it did not display itself, it did not need to be constantly renewed. It simply existed like the air that was breathed, like the water in which millions of people swam who had learned not to make waves. And when silence becomes routine, when obedience transforms into unconscious habit, the regime has reached its most perfect form of control. When fear lost its voice, the final cracks of a paralyzed nation. The system of fear that had kept Germany silent for more than a decade did not collapse suddenly or dramatically. There was no single moment when terror ceased to function, no precise instant when millions of people simultaneously decided to break their silence. What occurred was a process of gradual erosion, a slow and uneven wearing away that began when fear stopped performing its fundamental function, to provide an illusion of control and survival within chaos. During the first years of the regime, fear had been effective because it was accompanied by an implicit promise. If one obeyed, if one avoided standing out, if one adapted to the demands of the system, one could maintain a relatively stable life. That promise, although fragile and misleading from the beginning, gave rational meaning to the silence. Obedience at least offered the possibility of security. However, as the war progressed and material reality deteriorated dramatically, that logic began to crumble from its foundations. The Allied bombings introduced a form of terror that the regime could not control, dose, or direct strategically. Unlike political fear, which had been selective and educational, punishing specific individuals to educate entire masses, aerial violence was radically indiscriminate. It destroyed entire neighborhoods without distinguishing between loyalists and dissenters. It killed civilians who had demonstrated exemplary obedience for years. It reduced to rubble homes where silence had been carefully maintained for more than a decade. This change had a deep and destabilizing psychological impact. Political terror had worked because it seemed rational in its own perverse logic. There were implicit rules, although brutally unfair. There were behaviors that increased risk and behaviors that reduced it. The terror of total war, on the other hand, completely lacked this logic. Meeting the regime's demands no longer guaranteed protection. Silence no longer offered security. Obedience lost its value as a survival strategy. As German cities were systematically devastated, the official narrative began to lose credibility in an irreversible way. Propaganda obsessively insisted on the final victory, on miraculous weapons that would change the course of the war, on the inevitable superiority of the German people. But everyday experiences constantly contradicted these messages. Smoky ruins, increasing shortages of food, endless lists of the dead and missing became impossible evidence to ignore or rationalize. The fear was still present, perhaps more intense than ever, but it no longer managed to organize social behavior in the same way it had for years. It had lost its structuring function. People continued to be afraid, but that fear no longer automatically translated into obedience because obedience itself had ceased to offer real protection. In this context of progressive disintegration, cracks began to appear in the collective silence. It was neither an open rebellion nor an immediate mass awakening. The manifestations were scattered, fragmented, often still cautious. Bolder comments in bomb shelters where strangers shared the same terror. Veiled criticisms among people who had lost everything and no longer had much more to lose. Expressions of fatigue and hopelessness that had previously been completely unthinkable. The bomb shelters, paradoxically, became spaces where traditional social control temporarily weakened. In the shared darkness, while the bombs fell above, social hierarchies blurred. Imminent death temporarily equalized everyone. In those moments of shared terror, some people began to express what they had silenced for years. Not necessarily acts of organized resistance, but simple expressions of exhaustion, frustration, and hopelessness. The progressive collapse of administrative structures also weakened the apparatus of fear. As the state allocated increasing resources to the desperate war effort, the capacity for internal surveillance was affected. The bureaucracy of terror, so meticulous and omnipresent in times of relative stability, began to show obvious flaws: contradictory orders, administrative delays, lack of effective follow-up. The system remained brutal when it acted, but it was no longer omnipotent or omnipresent. The Gestapo, which had operated through the perception of its ubiquity, now faced increasingly severe resource limitations. Many of its agents had been reassigned to more urgent military or police functions. The civil reporting systems continued to operate, but the capacity of the apparatus to investigate and act on each report had been reduced. The actual likelihood of being punished for minor transgressions was diminishing, although the threat still existed for cases considered serious. Political justice, which had served as an exemplary instrument for years, became increasingly erratic and even counterproductive. The courts continued to issue severe sentences, the people's courts persisted in their summary proceedings, and executions for defeatism or treason multiplied. However, the social impact of these punishments diminished. In a society where death was omnipresent and daily, where thousands died weekly under bombardments, the threat of execution lost part of its differential deterrent effect. This paradox was significant. The regime intensified repression precisely when it was losing effectiveness. Executions increased, but their ability to terrorize the general population diminished. Fear continued to exist, but it now competed with other, more immediate fears. The fear of dying under bombs, of losing family members at the front, of dying from hunger in an increasingly devastated country. At the same time, the war exposed millions of Germans to realities that the regime had tried to keep away from civil society for years. Soldiers returning from the front, either injured or on temporary leave, brought with them stories that were impossible to fully reconcile with the official narrative. Although many of these stories were shared quietly and with caution, their gradual accumulation undermined the coherence of the dominant discourse. Refugees from the East, fleeing the Soviet advance, arrived with testimonies of military defeat that contradicted the proclamations of imminent victory. Civilians evacuated from destroyed cities brought with them physical evidence of the devastation that propaganda tried to downplay. This circulation of alternative information, although still limited and fragmented, created fissures in the regime's informational monopoly. The growing distance between propaganda and lived experience generated a particular form of exhausted cynicism. People continued to repeat slogans in public when it was absolutely necessary, but with an increasingly transparent awareness of their falsehood. This dissociation weakened the emotional effectiveness of fear. Obeying no longer even implied a semblance of belief, but only a calculation of immediate survival that was becoming less and less reliable. In the last years of the war, the regime responded to its loss of control by dramatically intensifying repression. Far from decreasing, executions, arbitrary punishments, and threats multiplied. Military and civil courts increasingly imposed capital sentences. New crimes were created. Definitions of treason expanded, and the arbitrariness of punishment reached extreme levels. However, this intensification did not restore the lost control. On the contrary, it revealed the growing desperation of the system. Fear was no longer applied with the surgical precision of previous years, but in an increasingly chaotic and counterproductive manner. When punishment becomes completely arbitrary and unpredictable, when anyone can be punished regardless of their actual behavior, the incentive to obey paradoxically dissipates. This repressive excess had a particularly notable effect in the last weeks of the regime. Summary executions of supposed defectors, public punishments for defeatism, paranoid persecutions of imaginary traitors. These actions no longer generated widespread obedience. They generated horror, of course, but also a mixture of resignation, disbelief, and, in some cases, an exhausted form of emotional detachment. The disintegration of the social fabric reached its peak in this final period. Trust had already been destroyed years earlier by mutual surveillance. Now, absolute physical and emotional exhaustion was added. People were tired of fearing, tired of being silent, tired of adapting to a system that could no longer protect them anyway. This fatigue did not necessarily translate into organized active resistance, but rather into a growing apathy towards the increasingly absurd demands of the regime. In many cases, silence persisted, but it had fundamentally changed in nature. It was no longer a calculated strategic silence designed to maximize survival. It was an empty silence, the product of exhaustion rather than calculation. It protected nothing because there was no longer much left to protect. It was simply the absence of energy to speak in an environment where speaking had ceased to seem relevant. As the military collapse became undeniable even for the most optimistic or naive, the regime attempted to appeal to an absolute, almost suicidal loyalty. The official narrative demanded resistance until the last man, fight to the death, total sacrifice for the final victory. However, this demand clashed head-on with years of obedience based precisely on the calculation of survival. Fear had taught millions of people to adapt, to yield, to prioritize personal and family safety over abstract principles. It had systematically eroded any tradition of heroic sacrifice for transcendent causes. When that kind of sacrifice was finally demanded, the system discovered that it had created a population conditioned for practical submission, not for self-destructive heroism. In the last weeks before the final collapse, internal violence reached grotesque levels. Summary executions by improvised tribunals, lynchings of supposed traitors, desperate punishments for any sign of lack of will to fight. These actions no longer generated the type of useful obedience that the regime needed. They generated paralysis, passive horror, or in some cases, desperate forms of evasion. Soldiers who deserted, civilians who hid, lower officials who simply stopped following impossible orders. It was not organized resistance in the traditional political sense, but a molecular disintegration of the system. The fear remained real and powerful, but it could no longer produce the behavior that the regime required. It could no longer sustain a rapidly decomposing state and military structure. The final collapse of the regime did not bring an immediate end to the silence. When the Allied forces occupied Germany, many Germans continued to remain silent, although now for different reasons. It was no longer fear of punishment from the Nazi regime, but a complex mix of shame, confusion, exhaustion, and a psychological incapacity to process what had happened. Years of self-censorship do not revert instantly. The habit of silence survived the system that had created it. People who had learned for more than a decade not to speak about certain topics, not to ask uncomfortable questions, not to express criticism, did not regain that ability overnight. Fear had modified deep mental structures. Many Germans then faced a bitter paradox. They had remained silent for years as a survival strategy, as a way to protect their families, as a rational response to an irrational system. Now they had to live with the consequences of that silence. The fear that had seemed to protect them for a time had turned into a psychological and moral weight that they would carry for decades. The post-war silence was different from the silence under the regime, but it was connected to it. It was not fear of immediate punishment, but rather difficulty in confronting what had been done and what had been allowed through inaction. It was psychologically easier to continue without speaking than to fully confront the magnitude of what had occurred and the role that silence itself had played in allowing it. Thus, the fear that had kept an entire nation silent did not end with a liberating explosion, but with a gradual exhaustion. It extinguished slowly, not because it was heroically defeated, but because the system that sustained it disintegrated under the weight of its own contradictions and of external forces that ultimately proved more powerful. The system of terror had functioned extraordinarily well, while fear had a clear function: to offer a logic of survival, no matter how brutal it was. When that function disappeared, when obedience stopped guaranteeing protection, when silence was no longer useful, fear lost its structuring capacity. It was suspended in the void, like a persistent echo of an era in which silence had seemed, for millions of people, the only possible way to move forward.